Welcome to this fifth lecture on the philosophy of nonviolence. This lecture focuses on civil disobedience as a core method or approach to nonviolent direct action. One of its more extreme approaches, and one of its most powerful in confronting and resisting injustice. Civil disobedience can be defined as a public, nonviolent, and conscientious breach of law undertaken with the aim of bringing about a change in laws or government policies. A key feature of civil disobedience, therefore, is the breaking of the law, breaching the law in order to, with the aim of changing that law. And civil disobedience entails the acceptance of the legal consequences of the breaking of the law, of the civil disobedient act. The civil disobedient must accept the legal consequences of breaking the law, including any type of jail sentence. Accepting the legal consequences demonstrates one's fidelity to the rule of law. The rule of law, in turn, is a necessary condition for justice. So to accept the legal consequences is to demonstrate one's affirmation of the basic idea of the rule of law. Civil disobedience is conscientious or principled in its perspective, and it communicates both a condemnation and a desire for change in law or policy. That is, one is acting, as we'll see later, one is acting out of what one believes and can justify as a just cause in the sense of resisting a law or policy that is taken to be unjust. Civil disobedience also falls between legal protest and conscientious refusal, revolutionary action, military protest, and organized forcible resistance. So it falls between a more mild form of protest, important forms of protest, such as legal protest or legal non-cooperation, etc., like, for example, a demonstration, a critical editorial, etc. That's one on one end. On the other end, on the other extreme, is revolutionary action, militant action, using force as a means of resistance. Civil disobedience lies between those two ends. And perhaps lying between those two ends, it is the most radical of nonviolent actions. Civil disobedience is also generally regarded as more morally justifiable than both ordinary breaking of the law, which is fairly obvious, and other forms of protest, other forms of militant protest. As we'll see, it has certain criteria of justification that speaks to its normative justification. Martin Luther King, in particular in the letter from a Birmingham jail, discussed and advocated for civil disobedience, and King himself was a a civil disobedient on many occasions. And in this instance, he has been sentenced to confinement in a jail in Birmingham, Alabama, for his breaking the law. And he argues that one has a moral responsibility to obey just laws, and this grounds the moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. If we have a responsibility to obey just laws, then he argues we have an equal moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. This refers back to the idea of a moral duty to resist injustice. Mohandas Gandhi also acknowledged that civil disobedience was at the core of nonviolent direct action, and he himself engaged in numerous acts of civil disobedience, resulting in him spending a number of years in British jails. The features of civil disobedience include conscientiousness, that is, a serious and sincere moral conviction that underlies the breach of the law, and that distinguishes the civil disobedient from the ordinary criminal who's not breaking the law. The ordinary criminal is not breaking the law to protest and resist and change unjust laws, but is doing it out of some sense of self-interest. A second feature is communication. Civil disobedience conveys both a condemnation as well as draws public attention to instigate a change in the law or policy. One of the features of civil disobedience is to communicate the injustice of a law and the need to change that law. It has both forward-looking and backward-looking aims. Backward-looking in the sense of condemnation, and forward-looking in the sense of changing the law. Along with communication, a prominent feature of civil disobedience is publicity. That is, the act of disobedience should never be covert or secretive. It should be committed in public, openly, with fair notice to legal authorities. And that shows a particular fairness to those authorities as well. So the civil disobedient act should be public, openly public. And finally, it should be nonviolent. It rejects violence in favor of the transformative power of suffering, of being willing to endure the penalties of breaking the law in order to change that law, in order to draw attention and awaken the moral consciousness of others to the injustice of that law. Civil disobedience is distinct from other types of dissent and protest, in particular legal protest, which lies within the bounds of the law, standing in front of a building, for example, with signs in protest of some law or policy of an institution without breaking the law as such, or legally parading in protest. Other rule departures constitute another form of protest. The deliberate decision of officials of the government not to discharge their duties, the duties of their office. And this refers to, an example of this is the Nuremberg obligation, which became prominent after World War II, the moral duty to disobey unlawful orders given to soldiers or officers from their superiors. The Nuremberg obligation, developed at the Nuremberg Tribunal after World War II, the trial of Nazi war criminals. Their standard defense in Nuremberg was that they were just following orders. The court ruled and established this obligation of a moral duty to disobey unlawful orders, and that obligation is codified in the Code of Honor and the legal code of militaries around the world. And that's an example of rule departures. The deliberate conscientious decision to disobey or not to discharge the duties of their office. It's not exactly a form of civil disobedience because it is conducted by various officials and not citizens. Another form of protest is conscientious objection, violation of the law motivated by a dissenter's belief that he or she is morally prohibited to follow the law. This occurs often with persons of religious conscience who take a pacifist position out of moral belief and theological belief that to engage in warfare violates their religious morality, and therefore they dissent, object in a conscientious way to service, etc. Radical protest, of course, is not civil disobedience. It involves the use of force to resist unjust laws, and that includes terrorism. Terrorism is a technique of radical protest that attempts to put political pressure on the government to change its policies by attacking innocent civilians. And revolutionary action also is quite distinct from civil disobedience. Its revolutionary action has the goal of regime change, of changing the political order. Civil disobedience is not aimed at changing the political order or the legal system as such, but civil disobedience is aimed at specific laws, not the legal system itself, specific laws that are understood to be unjust. Ronald Dworkin, a noted political and legal philosopher, a legal scholar, identified three types of civil disobedience. What he called one is integrity-based civil disobedience. Occurs when a citizen disobeys the law she or he feels is immoral. An example is abolitionists disobeying the fugitive slave laws during the time of slavery. A justice-based civil disobedience occurs when a citizen disobeys laws in order to lay claim to some right denied to her or him. That is, it's in protest of the denial of rights. And this was a hallmark of the civil rights movement, as well as Gandhi's independence movement in India, among many others. There's policy-based civil disobedience. And this occurs when a person breaks the law in order to change a policy she believes is wrong or unjust. So these are three types of civil disobedience identified by Dworkin. Civil disobedience is justified, can be morally justified on the grounds of a set of criteria criteria used to justify the action. So in general, there's a general prima facie moral obligation to follow the law. That is, all things being equal, we have a duty to obey the law. And based upon that prima facie obligation, we could ask what justifies breaking the law as an act of civil disobedience. Could it be the case that the breaking of a law be justified? And if so, on what grounds would it be justifiable? And there are at least 4 grounds or 4 criteria that can be used to justify an act of civil disobedience. The first is just cause, a duty, the recognition of a duty of non-cooperation and resistance to unjust laws. An action for the right reasons, well-founded, which meets the criteria we discussed earlier in this lecture relating to the distinct features of civil disobedience. A second criterion is last resort. The act of civil disobedience should be a last resort. Other means of protest and change should be exhausted before one engages in an act of civil disobedience. That is, if, and this is, last resort is determined by the immovability or intransigence or apathy of the majority or of the legal system to change, even in the face of significant dissent and protest. If change isn't forthcoming, then that's an indication that civil disobedience is the next step, and one can be confident that it is a last resort. A third criterion is likelihood of success, that the act of civil disobedience should have a good probability of achieving good consequences, that there is a high probability of producing positive change, and that the action be proportional. The civil disobedient be proportional to the good consequences. Fourthly, it should be direct. It should be specifically aimed at the particular unjust law. Civil disobedience is not a general form of protest to the legal system or political system itself, but it is aimed and focused on specific unjust laws. One could argue that the right, that civil disobedience is legitimate and justified based upon the democratic right of participation. And we can ask, does a democratic right to dissent, which is inherent in the nature of democracy, does it include a right of civil disobedience? Democracy is a governmental system that is based upon the consent of the governed, the consent of the people. It is driven by consensus. Consent, however, has implicit in it the right to dissent. If one is not free to dissent, then consent is not real. Real consent must leave open the possibility of dissent, because without dissent, then consent is forced. And so we could ask if the democratic right to dissent also includes a right to civil disobedience. Is it derivative from the right to participate in political decision making? Or is it derivative of other rights? like freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly? Is it derivative of liberty itself? Does it reflect the equal status of citizens? Etc. I think there are probably strong arguments to suggest that a democratic right to dissent includes a right to civil disobedience. So, in summary, these features are the features discussed are important elements of civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is the conscientious act of disobeying the law, disobeying unjust laws. And that disobedience is grounded in certain criteria of justification, as well as being distinct from other forms of protest. And I leave you with some possible other questions to contemplate as you think about the importance of civil disobedience. In the end, civil disobedience is a prominent and central approach to nonviolent direct action and nonviolent resistance to injustice. Thank you.